Okay, the numbers are climbing up nicely, so I will make a start nice and promptly so that we have plenty of time to answer any questions that any of you might have at the end of today's session. But good morning, good afternoon if you're joining from a different time zone, and thank you for coming to join our session today on navigating the future of textiles EPR. Today we're going to touch on a few different topics around textiles extended producer responsibility. Firstly, we'll go through a few global case studies, then we'll touch on brand perspectives and data preparation for textiles EPR systems around the world. Today's session is hosted by EARN, acronym for the European Advanced Recycling Network, with WRAP, the Waste of Resources Action Programme, headquartered in the UK, as the guest speaker. In terms of structure of today's session, that's displayed on the slide right now. Firstly, we will do a quick introduction before we jump into a few different country case studies. And the country case studies that we've selected are Italy, California, and the Netherlands. Then we'll go on to talk about some brand and manufacturer perspectives of textiles EPR schemes and how brands and manufacturers think those schemes should be designed and implemented so that they are operated effectively. And then we'll talk about some of the data challenges which are common for brands and manufacturers in textiles EPR schemes and how brands can prepare and mitigate those data challenges. Then we'll have a quick wrap up on what's going to be happening next around the world before we enter the Q&A session, where we will give some of you a chance to ask your questions to us and we will do our best to answer. I will supplement that statement by saying there were 800 registrations on this webinar, so we probably won't be able to answer all of your questions live, but even if you ask a question and we don't have time to answer it live, we will answer it in writing afterwards. My name is Jordan Gerling, and I'm working as Head of Extended Producer Responsibility at WRAP. WRAP are a climate action charity headquartered in the UK, but with offices also in Brussels to serve the European Union and Washington, DC to serve the Americas. And my role largely requires me to work with policymakers and governments who have to design and adopt these textiles EPR schemes around the world. And I also work really closely with the brands and manufacturers who have to comply with these schemes. And then I will pass to my co-speaker now, Cecilia, who will introduce herself.
Thanks, Jordan. Hi, I'm Cecilia Dowd. I work for EARN. I'm the resident expert on textiles EPR, and I'm paying attention to the emerging programs coming across the world with that. I've been working in extended producer responsibility for a long time. I've done my master's thesis in this area as well, and I welcome any questions afterwards if you need support. So a little introduction about EARN. We started out actually as an electronics recycling facility in 2003, when our founders realized very quickly that there was a great need to support producers in this regard. And then not long after that, they realized that producers really needed support also on following the regulations that were emerging and changing over time. So fast forward to today, we have a dedicated consultancy for extended producer responsibility and a broad team of expertise on helping companies to understand what their obligations are for waste electronics, batteries, packaging, and from now for textiles. And we can help you understand your obligations, implement and manage registrations. We're quite unique in that we do actually support companies to collect their waste as well as not just take care of their compliance obligations.
Thanks, Cecilia. Now, everybody, we will jump into the first section of the webinar, which is the country case studies. I will lead the first two country case studies, and Cecilia will lead the third. But before we dive into a few case studies, specifically for Italy, California, and the Netherlands, like I alluded to, this map shows the bigger picture of what's happening around the world. And following the key, the light green is countries where textiles EPR legislation has been formally passed. So businesses will likely have textiles EPR obligations there already. We have France, Hungary, Latvia, Netherlands, Kenya, and California. The dark green shows where there are active voluntary textiles EPR type schemes, so Australia and Colombia. The light blue shows where Textiles EPR is pending at an advanced level, which essentially means there's some sort of formal draft legislation to adopt Textiles EPR, or there's well-developed sectoral consultations. And those countries consist of the likes of Bulgaria, Chile, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Lithuania, New York, Spain, Sweden, and Washington State. And then we have the light browny colour, which shows countries where textiles EPR schemes are being discussed, but there's been no formal or progressive development just yet. And also, by the way, before we move on, there's no need to screen print any of these slides. We will share all of the slides and the recording with everybody who attended the session afterwards. Okay, the first country case study is for Italy. Like all 27 EU member states, per the 2025 revision to the EU Waste Framework Directive, it is mandatory for Italy to adopt a national textiles EPR scheme by 2028. Although Italy has been quite progressive and they will adopt textiles EPR well before that deadline. And the draft decree for textiles EPR in Italy, that was originally published back in December 22, and it had its second draft published in June 2023. The draft decree is now finalised and it's currently under ministerial review. As indicated by one of the directors at the Ministry of Environment in Italy back in October 2025, a final publication was expected to be in the first quarter of 2026. The eager eyes of you will recognise that we're in quarter two now. It hasn't been published yet, but it is under final ministerial review, so it should be published very, very soon. Due to Italy adopting a national textiles EPR scheme earlier than the mandatory deadline, various producer responsibility organisations, or PROs, as some people refer to them as, they've started to emerge to operate the scheme, and obligated businesses have started to become members of those PROs accordingly. You have the usual players that operate the EPR PROs in a range of other countries, like ERP, the European Recycling Platform, and Redress. They're owned by the Reconomy Group. And you also have the PROs that already operate EPR for other waste streams in Italy, like product packaging or waste electricals, for example, such as Aerion. And there's also a few other newer collectives as well, as you can see on this slide. I guess, of course, there's no right answer to who is the best pro or which pro should my company join. That's dependent on the type of business that you are and will vary depending on the company. But of course, there are organizations like the EPR experts at EARN that can help you determine which pro is the most financially and administratively attractive for you to join in different countries around the world. Some other key points on textiles EPR in Italy. Firstly, and quite importantly, which businesses are obligated to pay the EPR fee in Italy, i.e. who are the obligated businesses. Italy's decree, it indicates that producers are the first organisation that places the finished product on the national market, and they possess the EPR obligations. The producers of the finished products, they're usually the importers and brand holders, i.e. those that have the product manufactured by third parties, but place it on the market under their own brand. And secondly, an important element of Italy's textiles EPR scheme, which is a clear divergence from the overarching EU framework, is that it mandates the adoption of textiles EPR schemes, but producers will also have a take-back obligation, particularly for retailers. And let me elaborate on that to make it a bit clearer. So retail stores in Italy that have a surface area of more than 150 meters squared, they're required to accept used textiles on a one-for-one, like-for-like basis. So as an example, if you sell a t-shirt, you are obligated to take back a used t-shirt from that customer free of charge, even if you didn't sell them that t-shirt originally. And now I jump into California, which has had some very, very recent developments, which maybe some of you are already aware of. But as the kind of synopsis slide, I suppose, Textiles EPR Bill 707, that was signed into law in September 2024, which required the adoption of Textiles EPR in California. And the scheme is required to be fully implemented by July 2028. The product scope of California's scheme, which means the types of products that have an EPR fee associated to them, is clothing and accessories. But notably, things like PPE, reusable nappies and sanitary products, and also products which are already in scope of other EPR schemes, they are not in scope of California's Textiles EPR scheme. Companies are obligated to pay EPR fees in California, i.e. the producers. They are manufacturers of an in-scope product that own or license the brand of that product. But if there's no organization in California that fulfills that definition, the obligated producer is the importer of the products. Also notably, sellers that have an annual turnover of less than $1 million globally, they are exempted as small producers. They have no obligation to comply with the scheme in California. California scheme, it incorporates direct incentivization of circular products. Specifically, the producer responsibility organization must charge EPR fees that are eco-modulated. And this means the fees are discounted for products which are designed in a way to promote things like reuse and repair, thereby incentivizing product design choices. And coming to the enforcement box, non-compliant companies can receive fines of up to $50,000 per day of non-compliance. And also online marketplaces, they're required to notify the pro of all third-party sellers with sales of textiles more than $1 million in the preceding year. And that is to help the pro to identify and tackle non-compliant businesses. Another element of California's Textiles EPR scheme that promotes a sustainable ecosystem is that it prioritizes reuse by not classing sellers of secondhand clothing as obligated companies. So these companies can sell products without paying an EPR fee and will thereby have bigger profit margins. The pro, they're also required to operate consumer awareness programs that includes information on where consumers can purchase repaired and reused products. And last but certainly not least, to gain approval to operate as the pro was required to describe how they would prioritize the use of second-hand markets and non-profit thrift stores. And the operational plans of the pro were required to include market development investments to encourage reuse over recycling. Unlike in Italy, there will only be one pro for Textiles EPR in California. 3 organizations applied to be the designated Textiles EPR Pro in California. You had Circular Textile Alliance, Landbell USA, and Textile Renewal Alliance. And on the 27th of February 2026, Landbell were approved as the single pro by the regulator, CalRecycle. So they have been formally appointed now. And one element of Landbell's application to be the pro was the cost it would charge to businesses. So we are now able to present to you all today how much it will actually cost to comply with Textiles EPR in California. In the first year of the scheme operating, so 2027 or 2028 even, the EPR fee per pound of textile products sold will be 3 cents, increasing to 20 cents per pound by 2030. And that's expected to raise $412 million to finance the sustainable management of used and waste textile products arising on California's market. And there will also be an annual membership style fee to fund things like pro administration. That fee will be set at $1,000 per year, which is expected to raise a total of $19 million. And one last slide on California to highlight other elements of Landbell's approved pro application. On enforcement specifically, to minimize the level of non-compliant companies, Landbell will operate geo-targeted digital adverts, especially on platforms like LinkedIn for non-compliant companies. How do they expect to spend the money? Well, they expect to spend 80% of the EPR generated revenue on supply chain activities, which means things like collection, sorting, reuse, coordination, and recycling. 5 to 8% of the scheme on promotion and education programs, and the remaining 15 to 80% on scheme administration and innovation. And the scheme expects to invest 10 million into the market in 2027, increasing to 46 million in 2029. And one very last point on California before we move on to the Netherlands. Right at the end of March, one of the other applicants for the Pro that was led by the American Apparel and Footwear Association, they filed a legal petition challenging the regulator's selection of Landbell as the Pro, stating that it is not a producer-formed Pro, it's not adequately representative of the industry, and is not suitably a non-profit organisation. And there is a call for the regulator to halt any implementing action and enforcement of California's Textiles EPR scheme until that matter is closed. The regulator needs to review that, but quite notably, Landbell are already accepting producer members into membership of their pro, as of, I think, last week. So that concludes for California. Cecilia will pick up on the Netherlands before we move on to the second part of the webinar. Over to you, Cecilia.
Thanks, Jordan. So we're going to go from an up-and-coming program to one that is established in the Netherlands. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Jordan. So the Dutch system has already been up and running now for a few years. The Dutch decree came into force in the 1st of July in 2023. So they have some experience now behind them on how this is functioning, and it seems to be running well. It is important to note, since the recent amendment to the Waste Framework Directive has been released, this law will need to be updated, and they are in the process of doing that so that it is harmonized with the law. So the Netherlands has the same deadline as every other EU member state to implement this, and that is 17th of June 2027. So up until that date and in between, the scope of products will change slightly. So currently, the Dutch obligations include all clothing, and that includes workwear, so things like overalls for a professional work environment. And it also includes household textiles, but not all. So things like towels and bed sheets, tea towels, tablecloths, that's all in scope right now. And then they will add the other categories they're in that are in the Waste Framework Directive recommendation. Things like curtains and blankets will be added in, and that's a more extensive list. That's just an example. Also to be added in will be things like shoes, leather goods, bags, hats, and things that are described in the Waste Framework Directive. So if you are already complying in the Netherlands, keep an eye out and we can update you as well when that change happens, and they will for sure make an announcement about it. There are two unique features to the Dutch system. That is, if you are a Dutch seller, you don't need an authorized representative. But if you're selling from another country outside the Netherlands to Dutch end users, you must appoint what's called an authorized representative. This includes companies who are based outside of Europe. You would be called a foreign distance seller. The reporting is also a little different to France, for example, which was already an established system for a long time. And you must report by weight in kilos. The French system reports by unit, and the Dutch one reports by kilos. Next slide, please. Thank you. So who has to comply with this? Who is a producer? It's a very broad and very typical definition of producer, and it is the party that places the textiles on the Dutch market. And that includes, as I said before, foreign distance sellers. So it doesn't matter what selling technique you use. So if you do not have a bricks and mortar store in the Netherlands and you only sell online, you are included as a producer. There is an obligation on all textile producers in the Netherlands to provide a free take-back system for all Dutch consumers. So there are three components of this that you must be aware of. One is that it must be available all the time, all year round, and it cannot be contingent on where it's cost effective for the textile producer to operate this collection system. The second thing is it must be free of charge. There's no requirement for a consumer to buy something from the shop or from the online store. You must be able to accept used textiles back from them for no charge and no need to buy. And it also has to operate continuously. So if, for example, you meet your collection target partway through the year, you can't just pause the program and save costs that way. You must operate it throughout the year no matter what.
Next slide, Cecilia.
Next slide. Oh, sorry, yes, next slide.
No worries.
So there are some targets to be aware of if you're a textiles producer in the Netherlands. The first one to discuss is a combined target for reuse and recycling. This is combined. So this is based on what you placed on the market in the previous year. So for example, if we just take this current year of 2026 and we look at what you placed on the market in 2025. So the target for 2026 for reuse and recycling combined is 55%. So if we say, for example, you placed 1 ton of textiles on the Dutch market in 2025, that would mean that in 2026, you must collect, reuse, and recycle 55% of that 1 ton. So that's 550 kilos. Now, if we look at just reuse alone, there's a specific target for this, and that a certain percentage has to be dedicated to reuse. So if we take our example again, say you placed 1 ton of product on the market in 2025, in 2026, the percentage target for reuse is 21% by weight. That means that you would need to capture 210 kilos of what you placed on the market in 2025, and that must be directed towards reuse. There's also a very specific thing, and that half of that needs to be prepared for reuse in the Netherlands. So that would be 110 kilos in that example. So you need to think about what systems you have in place to collect this, to sort it, to identify what is capable of being reused. And half of that has to be done in the Netherlands. So it has to go back to be available to Dutch consumers inside the Dutch border. Next slide, please. There's also a target for fiber to fiber recycling. So you need to take a percentage of what is recycled, and that needs to be directed towards taken from recycling from an end-of-life textile and be turned back into a reusable textile, such as a roll of fabric. So if we take our example again, so you placed 1 ton of textile product on the market in 2025. In 2026, your target will be 27%. That means 270 kilos needs to be recycled back into a reusable fiber, say, for example, a roll of recycled polyester, for example. There's also a recycled content requirements, but this is not designated as a set target. You need to make sure that you actually take measures to incorporate recycled textiles into your products as much as possible. There's no set specific target for this, but you need to be able to demonstrate that you have taken every effort. So the decree says, take measures intended to ensure that as many recycled textile fibers as possible are incorporated. So you may need to document what efforts you have made, such as meetings you've held with recycled fiber companies, analysis of your products to identify which products would be suitable to have a substitution for recycled content, etc., etc. So make sure you think about that and start to embed that into your processes in your organization. The recycled content has to be derived from fiber to fiber as well, rather than just unused fiber. Next slide, please. There are currently 3 PROs available for producers in the Netherlands. The Stichting UPV Textiel, Then ERP for Landbell, we heard about them in California. They're quite a global company. They also have a presence in the Netherlands as an option. And the Collectief Circular Textile is another option. So you have three choices of PRO for the Netherlands for your products.
Thanks, Cecilia. Now, everybody, we have a webinar section on brand and business perspectives for how Textiles EPR schemes are designed, implemented, and operated. What does that actually mean? Well, for companies that will actually have to pay the EPR fees, how do they think the scheme should be adopted to maximize the scheme's impact while still minimizing the impacts being placed on businesses? The first slide of this section, so we know that clothing and footwear accounts for 43% of global cross-border e-commerce purchases. And the global market size for cross-border fashion shopping was $477 billion in 2024, and that's projected to increase to $2 trillion by 2034. Yeah, yes, that was trillion with a T, not a billion with a B. And what that means is foreign companies, they have to be classed as producers and they have to be obligated to pay these EPR fees so that they can also contribute to the sustainable management of used and waste products which are arising on the market. Otherwise, the local companies would be unfairly burdened by financing the sustainable management of all used and waste textiles arising on the market, even when they were not responsible for selling them in the first place. And foreign sellers should also be considered beyond the legislative definition of producer. The EPR schemes should allow foreign sellers to comply with mandatory scheme elements that traditionally would only apply to domestic sellers. And of course, I give you an example to explain what I mean. So if the EPR scheme places mandatory in-store take-back obligations on producers, for example, there should be an option to fund a collective take-back scheme if the producer chooses not to take back used products directly. And that would require foreign sellers to contribute to the same obligations, and it doesn't place an unfair disadvantage on domestic sellers. And as a bit of a related example there, this is the case in the UK's producer responsibility scheme for waste electricals and electronics, where there is a DTS, which is an acronym for Distributor Take-Back Scheme. And companies can pay into that if they don't want to take back waste products directly. And the funding from the DTS is reinvested into other collection points. So that allows foreign companies to pay in and increase domestic collection rates, even if they can't take back products in the country themselves. Now coming to smaller companies, we know that small and medium-sized enterprises represent over 99% of all EU businesses. And for the textile sector specifically, the value chain consists of 267,000 businesses, 99.5 of which are SMEs. And EPR schemes, they can place quite notable burdens on SMEs, not only the financial burden, i.e. paying the EPR fees, but also the administrative burdens, such as having to report data systematically in all of the different countries where they sell. And it's really important for EPR schemes to recognize these burdens and seek to minimize them for SMEs. And there's a range of different options for how textiles EPR schemes can minimize these burdens for smaller companies. For example, the pros, they can adopt some form of simplified registration, data reporting, and/or EPR fee payment processes for SMEs to minimize their administrative burdens. So France's primary pro for packaging EPR, they're called Satio. They allow businesses that sell less than 10,000 units into France per year to pay a flat rate annual contribution of €80 without the need to submit any sort of data whatsoever. And they also allow producers that sell less than 500,000 units per year to submit a simplified annual data report. And as a second example, SMEs could also be granted some sort of deferral or even complete exemptions to Textiles EPR obligations that would present notable challenges to them. As an example of a complete exemption, the overarching framework directive for waste electricals and electronics EPR in the EU that requires distributors of small products, which are products with no external dimension more than 25 centimeters, to take back small products free of charge without the obligation for consumers to buy a replacement product from that distributor. But that is only for larger distributors that have a sales area of at least 400 meters squared. As an example of a deferral rather than a complete exemption, the European Parliament have stated that for textiles EPR schemes in the EU, micro enterprises, that's businesses with less than 10 employees and an annual turnover not exceeding 2 million euros, they will have a 1-year deferral to comply with textiles EPR obligations to help them prepare for those obligations. So whereas larger companies will have to comply in every EU member state by April 2028, I think it is, smaller companies will have until April 2029. And I guess lastly, but certainly not least for this section, the surplus funding generated by textiles EPR schemes, such as funding generated by EPR fee eco-modulation penalties, they could be used to fund initiatives that support SMEs. So as an example, there could be a centralized pro-operated fund that SMEs can apply to for grants that would support adoption and or scaling of product durability efforts or circular business models. Moving to the next slide on harmonisation. So harmonising textiles EPR schemes across country borders, that can offer notable benefits across the value chain. And a good example is data reporting harmonisation. For companies that sell products in various countries, they can really struggle to comply with EPR if they need to submit data in different formats in every country. But in the EU, thanks to the centralised Waste Framework Directive, and the criteria for eco-modulating EPR fees must be harmonised across the 27 EU member states. And that means companies will report data in the same way in those 27 states. And what does that actually mean? Well, to avoid one country offering discounts for businesses making products more recyclable, a different country offering discounts for businesses making the products more durable, and maybe even a different country offering discounts for businesses making the products to incorporate a certain level of recycled content, all of which can contradict each other. To increase the incentivization level for businesses, all EU countries must provide discounts on the same thing. And in the EU, that will most probably be steered towards product durability to tackle things like ultra-fast fashion. Lastly, on this slide, quite importantly, the rate of eco-modulation in the EU, that does not need to be harmonised. So, for example, one country may offer a 5% EPR discount for a more durable product, whereas a different country might choose to offer a significantly higher discount, like 50%, 60%, 70%, whatever. A bit more on eco-modulation. So the eco-modulation of EPR fees, that allows the producer responsibility organisations to operate the schemes to apply fee discounts or bonuses for products which satisfy specific sustainability criteria. So that thereby provides a direct financial incentive for companies to produce and sell products that are more sustainable and circular in the first instance. To be effective, the eco-modulation criteria, it needs to be simple, and also it needs to be quite cheap to comply with. Because if the eco-modulation criteria is too burdensome on businesses and they're unable to satisfy the reporting requirements in practice, due to lack of data, for example, The eco-modulation, that will become somewhat redundant and it won't have the desired impact that the EPR scheme wants it to have. The rate of eco-modulation, i.e. the scale of the EPR fee discount, that needs to be higher or at least equal to the cost incurred by businesses to satisfy the eco-modulation requirements. So again, if I give you an example of textiles eco-modulation criteria that is easy, I use the word easy loosely, for businesses to report data against in practice. We can take Australia's Textiles Product Stewardship Scheme as the example, and that's operated by the Seamless Pro type organisation. But they, for garments that have a primary material from a mono material or a single fibre at a rate of at least 95%, thereby promoting product recyclability by facilitating simpler recycling under a single stream. They offer fee reductions of 25% of the EPR fee. And that is quite an easy thing for producers to report data against. They know if the product consists of 95% of one fibre, and therefore they can report data against that quite easily. And now we come to the last segment of today's presentation before we enter the questions area, and that is some of the common data challenges associated with EPR and some methods which producers can use to overcome those challenges. And that will be led by Cecilia. So I will pass to Cecilia now.
Thanks, Jordan. So one of the most important elements of Textiles EPR is how to manage your data, and that is really mostly focused on reporting. So most textile companies are already very accustomed to compliance because there are so many different laws that overlay textile garments. So this will just be an additional thing. This will be at the end stage rather than the beginning stage of the lifetime of a garment. So you will be required when you register in many cases to provide data on what you think you'll place on the market. And once you're registered, you'll have to report what you place on the market in each country. This will be in different forms. For example, if we take the example of France and the Netherlands, in the French system currently, you need to report your sales by unit, by specific product category. So in the Dutch system, you're going to be doing that by weight. So your IT systems need to be able to accommodate these nuances and differences from one EU member state to the other. And as we see more countries publishing their laws and them coming into force, we'll be able to understand just how different it's going to be. We may end up with a lot of similarities across the European Union, but we may end up with a mosaic of slightly different requirements for each country. And you have a bit of time now because we still have just over a year before these laws are published, and you have 2 years before you must comply with all of them across the European Union as the very latest deadline. We know that some countries are going to implement before then. So you have a window of time now to take a look at what you're currently operating with to see if your existing system can handle that. So for example, today, could you, if somebody asked you, produce a report that summarizes that information? If not, you may need to go and talk to your IT people to say, do we just need to add some fields to our existing IT system to capture this data? If not, do you need to upgrade that system, or do you need a completely new system? So you have time now, which is great. You don't need to do this in a panic, to actually look at this and start working on what you will need to prepare. So the sort of things that you might need to incorporate in this system will be obviously what you place on the market. It's the most important one, but you may need to also make provision for fiber content. So what component is recycled? What is the reuse status of these garments? You also have to be able to capture what you take back and report on that. So you need to be able to sometimes do this by category as well. So the nuances of this will vary from country to country. So to maintain this as well, you need to also have a system embedded in place in your internal organizational processes to capture new products as they come out. In the clothing industry, for example, there's new lines all the time. That's the nature of the industry. So do you currently have that ability to capture your spring collection capture all those weights, put them into your system. Is it automated, or do you need to do a manual check on that? Best of all would be if you can automate it, obviously. That would be less touch points for everybody. But some companies may need to, because they're often quite small companies and they don't have the resources, they may need to do this manually. Reporting can really vary. At minimum, you should expect to have to report annually, but you might need to report quarterly or even monthly. And sometimes there are additional annual reports required. Sometimes you might actually be required to submit a plan for how you are managing your environmental footprint, or what is your waste reduction strategy, and what have you done to increase the inclusion of recycled content? What have you done to minimize fibers that have a high environmental impact? And this all sort of falls under the loose banner of data reporting. You may also be required to sign declarations about what you have placed on the market in previous years. One thing that's come up in France that they didn't used to have in previous years was that if you have sold product into France in the last 5 years, you must actually report back 5 years. If you can't provide that data, you will be charged for that data. Or you are required to submit a certification that states you did not place product on the market in France in the last 5 years, and it needs to be signed by a certified accountant, for example. So it's a bit legal, right? You need to be sure that you're signing that and it is actually true. Some countries will actually select you for audit. This might be automatic or it might be random. So you do need to be prepared to be able to produce this information at short notice. Next slide, please. So to do this, you need to start thinking now about, if you haven't already done this, how are you going to integrate this into your organization? Ideally, you'll have one person who was responsible for this, your central EPR coordinator. And then you need to think, can this person manage this on top of what they're already doing now, or do you need some external support? This type of work does actually impact many different departments in an organization, and you need to be able to have all of them to seamlessly fit together and provide data when it's necessary. You probably need to implement tracking systems if you don't have them already, to look at progress metrics to say, how are our registrations going as they get implemented? How do we manage invoices? How is the reporting managed? How is our waste plan managed? And about take-back management as well, and how they work together. So you might also need to take a look and see how this impacts on other departments. So for example, the executive branch, sales and marketing or accounting might need to get reports from the person who is reporting the data back to the collection schemes and the government authorities to say, what are the costs of this and how does this impact on our budget and how can we manage that and plan for it? And that's ideal within any organization, is to communicate a strategy for this across your organization, for example, in an all hands meeting. Next slide, please. So what's next? Obviously, as new EPR programs emerge across the European Union, there will be a need for updates, and we will do regular updates, I think, Jordan, about this as new countries come online. Particularly, for example, as we saw with Italy, we were expecting it already, but it's slightly delayed. So we will update everybody as things come online. So EARN is global expertise in this. We don't just operate in Europe as well. So if you need to have support on this, if you don't think this is something that you can manage 100% internally, please reach out. This is what we do all day, every day, and we're here for you. And has coverage over all of Europe, but we also work outside of Europe, and we have some centers. We have a center in Germany, which is our main head office. We also have another head office in the UK, and we can manage things from either location. And our founders come from 4 countries. They come from Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, and from Spain.
Thanks, Cecilia.